French language is no longer welcome in Burkina Faso." Those were the only words Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke that morning. No warning, no explanation. Just a single sentence that shattered a century of dependency. The room, packed with government officials and advisors, froze. No one moved. No one even breathed. In that moment, the entire direction of the nation shifted, and perhaps the entire continent. For nearly 100 years, French had been more than just a language in Burkina Faso. It was the code of power, the currency of success. To speak French was to be heard, to be taken seriously, to be part of the world the West had built. But with one sentence, Traoré had flipped the table over. His voice was calm, but the fire behind it was unmistakable. When one minister dared to ask, "Do you mean in official spaces?" Traoré turned, looked him in the eye, and replied, "I mean everywhere." Outside, the air was still. The capital city, Ouagadougou, continued its daily rhythm, unaware that within those thick government walls, a political earthquake had just begun. Within hours, though, that silence would break, and the shockwaves would circle the globe. News broke like lightning. French media outlets screamed the headlines before lunch. Traoré bans French language, chaos in West Africa. Linguistic coup in Burkina Faso, a move too far? France responds to radical ban in former colony. Television screens across France showed panicked experts analyzing what this could mean. Western commentators called it reckless, dangerous, short-sighted, But on the streets of Burkina Faso, it was a very different story. Children danced, teenagers pulled out their phones and began recording messages in Moré, Dioula, Fulfulde, languages long buried under colonial education systems. Elders sat on porches and wept quietly, not out of fear, but because for the first time in decades they heard their mother tongues honored, not shamed. In the presidential quarters, Traoré stood silently by a window. He held in his hands a worn, leather-bound diary, his mother's diary, written in Moré, her native language. She had passed away before he ever took power, but her words remained. One entry had haunted him for years. It read, "The day they stole our words, they stole our pride." And that was the heart of it. This wasn't about words, it was about identity. It was about chains wrapped in polite grammar, about an entire nation forced to speak the language of their oppressors just to get a job, pass an exam, or be taken seriously. The French language wasn't neutral, it was inherited trauma disguised as education, and Traoré had just said enough. What the world didn't yet know was that Traoré had seen something the night before that pushed him to this breaking point. A top-secret intelligence report had landed on his desk. Inside were transcripts of private conversations between high-ranking French diplomats and two West African presidents. In these talks, France proposed a multi-million euro initiative, a soft power campaign designed to strengthen French cultural presence in Africa. But the report revealed the real goal, indoctrination. France planned to reintroduce heavy French-only education programs, promote French influences across African social media, and flood universities with French-trained instructors. They called it a linguistic reset, but in truth it was a new form of colonization, not with guns this time, but with language, and Burkina Faso was the first target. That night, Traoré didn't sleep. He walked barefoot through the palace gardens until dawn, staring at the sky. By morning, his decision was made. He wouldn't wait for approvals, he wouldn't form a committee, he would act and let the world catch up. In Paris, officials were livid. Within 24 hours of the ban, France froze $128 million in development aid. It revoked diplomatic visas, closed its cultural centers in Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso. The French Foreign Ministry released a scathing statement condemning the aggressive linguistic policies of Burkina Faso and warned that this unfortunate isolation would only harm its own people. Western analysts joined the outrage. Panel after panel warned that Traoré was dismantling the nation's economy, that investors would pull out, that his country would crumble under the weight of its own pride. But Traoré didn't respond. He was focused on something deeper. In classrooms across the nation, new posters went up. "Speak to lead," they said, in 5 local languages. Schools were given emergency funding to begin developing curriculum in native tongues. Linguists from neighboring countries were brought in. A national plan was launched to translate government services, legal codes, and healthcare guidelines into the languages of the people. This was not chaos, it was liberation, but not everyone saw it that way. Inside government halls, whispers began. Some ministers were uneasy. Business leaders were furious. Elite families, many of whom had sent their children to French boarding schools, called it a disgrace. And then, betrayal struck. An anonymous recording surfaced. In it, a Burkina Faso ambassador was heard speaking to a French diplomat. "Don't worry," he said. "He's emotional. We can reverse this. Just give us a few weeks." The clip leaked online and exploded like wildfire. Burkina Faso felt betrayed from within. People demanded resignations. Protesters surrounded government buildings, demanding to know how deep the betrayal ran. For the first time, Traoré's supporters looked shaken. And yet, Traoré didn't punish the ambassador. He didn't react at all. Instead, he called a press conference. No script, no press team, just him, a wooden podium, and the eyes of the world. "I have been told I am emotional," he began. "They are right. I am. I am emotional because I have seen grandmothers cry as their grandchildren fail school because they cannot speak the language of their colonizer. I am emotional because our courts still require our people to plead for justice in a tongue they do not understand. I am emotional because every time we speak, we are reminded that our voices were once considered noise and that noise was silenced." He paused, looked into the camera. "But I am not ashamed of this emotion. I am ashamed it took us this long." His words hit like a thunderclap. Across Africa, the reaction was electric. Social media lit up, not just in Burkina Faso, but in Mali, Niger. Across the diaspora, in Harlem, in Brixton, in Port-au-Prince, people began asking the same question: what if we did the same? And that is when France moved to the next phase. They knew they had lost control of the conversation, so they changed the strategy. They didn't attack Traoré with weapons, they attacked him with narrative. French news channels ran stories calling him unstable, erratic. They interviewed African intellectuals, many on French payrolls, who claimed the ban would cripple literacy. They showed tearful mothers saying their children were scared, confused, that Traoré had robbed them of opportunity. It was psychological warfare, and for a moment, it worked. Inside the presidential palace, the mood shifted. Advisors reported growing discontent. International phone lines were dead. Several NGOs announced they were leaving the country. A key ally in the West African bloc suspended trade talks. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time since he took power, Traoré sat alone in his office and questioned himself. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at the wall for hours, the silence heavy around him. Outside, the people waited. Would their leader cave? Would he reverse course? Would he bend like so many before him? But instead of speaking, he wrote. Late into the night, Traoré took a pen and scribbled a note, not to the world, but to a young girl he once met in a dusty village years ago. A girl who asked him why she couldn't learn in her own language. To her, he wrote, "They say we need French to survive, but you and I both know the truth. We need dignity more." That letter never made it to her. But its spirit, it made it to every heart that had ever been silenced by a foreign tongue. And as dawn broke over Burkina Faso, one thing became clear. The battle for language was no longer about words. It was about who gets to define Africa's future. And Ibrahim Traoré had just drawn the line. More than any ban, more than any speech, this was a declaration, not just to France, not just to the West, but to every African who had ever been told they were too local, too uneducated, too unsophisticated to lead the world in their own voice. Traoré had given them a weapon more powerful than bullets. He gave them back their words. And this was only the beginning. There are moments in history when the world doesn't blink. It stares, wide-eyed, anxious, holding its breath. This was one of those moments just hours after Traoré's bold declaration banning the French language across Burkina Faso. The silence in Western diplomatic halls turned into chaos. Meetings were called in haste. Phone lines rang non-stop. No one had anticipated this, and certainly no one had expected it from him, Captain Traoré, the soldier-turned-leader they once underestimated. But now they were panicking. In Paris, the French president was briefed in a sealed room under full security. There was no smile, no polite diplomacy, only rage. "He is attacking the very structure of our relationship," one advisor said. "No," another whispered, "he's tearing down the empire we never admitted still existed." Within 24 hours of Traoré's announcement, France acted, not with tanks, not with soldiers, but with something far more dangerous: control of the global narrative. French news anchors, dressed in calm blues and serious tones, looked straight into the camera and told the world Burkina Faso has turned its back on modern civilization. Education is under attack. A rogue leader isolates his people with reckless cultural policies. It was fast, it was calculated, it was brutal. And it wasn't just words. France immediately froze all bilateral aid projects. Medical shipments were halted at customs. Contracts with French companies were suspended indefinitely. Major development loans were declared void. In a single day, Burkina Faso lost access to nearly $400 million in promised infrastructure funding. The international market responded with fear. The Burkinabe currency began to slide. Investors started withdrawing. Whispers turned into headlines. Is Burkina Faso collapsing? Traoré's gamble backfires? Inside the country, tension grew. Not everyone had wanted this war. In upscale neighborhoods in Ouagadougou, businessmen murmured over breakfast meetings. "This is madness," one muttered. "We cannot survive this isolation," said another. But in the rural heartlands, in the villages where French had never truly replaced the native tongue, people didn't panic. They listened. And then they waited, because they knew something the cities didn't. This wasn't about economics, it wasn't about political correctness, it was about reclaiming something stolen. While the elite wrung their hands, the youth mobilized. Social media platforms erupted in a movement of raw energy and fierce pride. Young artists began releasing spoken-word poetry in native languages. Folk singers turned villages into stages. Farmers recorded, "This is the land my grandfather died for, not for French, not for Paris, for us." Across the diaspora, from Harlem to Johannesburg, from Port-au-Prince to Brixton, a different kind of support surged. African Americans, Haitians, Afro-British youth, they saw themselves in Traoré. They had felt the same thing. The ache of being told your language is improper, your name is too hard to pronounce, your voice is too angry. They saw Traoré not just as a leader, but as a mirror. And so they spoke. They created TikToks, tweets, reels, essays. Language is power. We are not ashamed anymore. This is not just Burkina Faso's fight. This is all of us. Meanwhile, Traoré remained silent. In the presidential residence, he walked alone. Security had increased. Several French-aligned officers had mysteriously resigned. One of his closest advisors had fled to Côte d'Ivoire under the guise of family illness. The smell of betrayal still lingered. His cabinet urged him to speak, to calm the public, to reassure investors. But he waited because he knew this wasn't the time for soft words. This was the time for resilience. But something happened Traoré hadn't prepared for. The schools. Across the country, teachers found themselves facing a dilemma they never expected. The order was clear: begin transitioning all education into native languages. But how? Most textbooks were in French, most exams, most lesson plans. In one small school near Ouagadougou, a teacher named Esther stood before her class with tears in her eyes. 30 students stared at her, wide-eyed, confused. She took a deep breath and began to speak. In Moré? Not perfectly, not fluently, but from the heart. At first, the children didn't respond. Then slowly, They smiled. One girl raised her hand, not to ask a question, but to say something she'd never said out loud in a classroom. "My grandmother used to sing to me in that language." Esther broke down, and in that moment, everything changed. Across the nation, similar stories unfolded. Teachers struggling, students learning, communities stepping in, grandmothers coming to classrooms to help translate, elders sharing their wisdom not from books, but from memory. It was not efficient, but it was beautiful. France responded with something colder. They announced a global education grant, $1 billion for any African nation that commits to preserving the French linguistic heritage. A bribe, wrapped in elegance. Some countries jumped, others hesitated. Traoré? He didn't respond. Instead, he did something bolder. He called for the creation of the African Linguistic Union, a pan-African body dedicated to preserving, digitizing, and promoting native African languages across the continent. He pledged funding, offered tech support, invited scholars. The world blinked again. Now, this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about Africa. And the West knew it. In Washington, in London, in Brussels, urgent briefings began. Traoré was being called many things: unpredictable, revolutionary, dangerous, but one term began appearing more frequently in intelligence reports: contagious, because revolution is a virus, and language, it spreads. France, desperate to regain control, turned to influence operations. They sent trusted African intellectuals to the media. Well-dressed, well-spoken figures on TV said things like, "Yes, cultural identity matters, but without French, how do we remain competitive in global markets? Africa cannot isolate itself." Traoré is charismatic, but misguided. They spoke calmly, persuasively, and some Burkinabe elites began to nod. Doubt returned. In the palace, one advisor told Traoré, "Sir, you've inspired the world, but if this continues, we might lose the country." Traoré listened quietly, then asked, "Can a man lose a house if it was never truly his to begin with?" The advisor didn't answer, because he couldn't. That night, a shocking event occurred. The French ambassador to Ghana gave a speech. Midway through, a protester shouted, "Long live Traoré!" The ambassador paused, then laughed, not kindly, not dismissively, but mockingly. "You really believe that boy can stand against France?" he said. "Let's see how long before he begs us to speak again." The video went viral in hours. It backfired spectacularly. Because now it wasn't just about language anymore, it was about dignity. Even some of France's oldest allies began to go silent. Leaders in Mali and Niger stopped making public statements. Chad pulled back from a new French deal, and in a stunning turn, Guinea's president tweeted, "Every African child should hear the voice of their ancestors in their own tongue." Traoré saw it, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. But even as global support grew, the internal situation remained fragile. Food prices were rising, fuel shortages began, business confidence was slipping. Some urban youth, jobless and angry, began to question the direction. Social tensions. Traoré knew that inspiration wasn't enough, so he acted. He announced a bold new economic plan: create over 50,000 new government jobs focused on language translation, curriculum development, cultural archiving, and linguistic tech innovation. He called it the Voice Project. Overnight, thousands of unemployed graduates, many frustrated by the French system, found purpose, found income, found hope. For the first time, the revolution was putting food on the table. But France wasn't done. At a press event in Brussels, a former French intelligence officer stepped forward with evidence that Traoré's government was receiving support from Russian military units. The accusation hit hard. Headlines exploded. "Traoré, a puppet of Moscow. Is Africa the next Ukraine? French language ban orchestrated by Kremlin?" It was a dirty move, and it worked. The UN issued statements of concern. The IMF warned of economic collapse. Western embassies began evacuating staff. Burkina Faso suddenly felt very, very alone. In a private meeting, one of Traoré's senior military commanders said, "We cannot survive a Cold War. The people will not last." But Traore looked him in the eye and said, "We did not survive colonialism to bow to PR tactics." Then he stood, walked to the national map, and pointed at the northern border. "Prepare the border schools. They're the first target of the next attack, and it won't be with guns, it will be with textbooks." Because Traore knew something the world didn't. They weren't just trying to break his spirit, they were trying to erase his story, and he wasn't going to let them. Not now, not ever. He sat in the dark, the lights off, the only sound in the room the faint ticking of an old military wall clock. Traore hadn't moved in hours. The weight of silence had grown heavier by the day. He could feel it pressing against his chest, slowing his breath, making even blinking feel like a task. But what he was really listening for was betrayal. And it was coming. The French media storm hadn't broken him. The economic sabotage, the diplomatic isolation, even the smear campaigns, they hadn't made him flinch. What did was something far more painful. A message, simple, short, delivered by a courier whose hands were visibly shaking. The note read, "They've flipped Nanga." Nanga, his childhood friend, the man who had fought beside him in the trenches of the revolution, the one who'd once carried Traoré on his back when he was wounded, limping through smoke and chaos, the one who swore that Burkina Faso would be reborn, or they would both die trying. And now he had sold that vision. Intelligence confirmed it. A leaked recording caught Nanga speaking in French, perfect Parisian French, on the phone with a diplomat stationed in Ivory Coast. He's emotional. He doesn't see the bigger picture. France can still be part of Africa's growth if we negotiate. He doesn't want to listen. In that moment, Traoré didn't feel anger. He didn't even feel betrayal. He felt grief, because what Nanga had said was worse than treason. It was a surrender of belief, a belief that Africa could rise on its own terms, in its own tongue, under its own flag, without compromise. Word spread quickly. Some denied it. Others made excuses. But in the pit of the president's war room, everyone understood the implication. If Nanga had flipped, more could follow. Not all betrayals came with guns. Some wore suits and smiles. Some signed aid deals. Some wrote op-eds in European newspapers, begging for pragmatism. Traoré called an emergency midnight session, not with the entire cabinet, just his core team, the ones who had been with him in the mud and blood before the cameras came. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound his fist. He simply said, "We will move forward, even if we walk alone." Across the country, pressure mounted. Inflation was real. Food prices were rising. Rural markets slowed. The youth, once energized by his boldness, were beginning to ask hard questions. In Bobo Dioulasso, a protest erupted, not against Traoré's values, but against the silence that followed them. Students demanded answers. Small business owners asked how they were supposed to thrive in a collapsing market. A woman on the street screamed into a camera, "We love him, but love doesn't feed my children." It cut deep, and the West saw an opportunity. France released a series of carefully crafted videos showing African children attending schools in Mali and Senegal, smiling, happy, learning in French. The message was subtle but devastating. Order, progress, development, it all flowed through French. Even more brutal was the psychological play. A viral headline spread like wildfire. Will Traoré's language war leave a generation illiterate? It worked, at least on the surface. An emergency meeting of African Union education ministers was called. Traoré wasn't invited, not officially, but they... Inside Burkina Faso, opposition voices grew louder. This wasn't resistance from colonizers anymore, it was internal unrest, born of desperation. Even within his team, doubts began to fester. Koulibaly, the Minister of Economy, requested a private audience with the president. He entered slowly, nervously. "Mr. President," he began, "the banks are tightening, investors are panicking. Our reserves won't last another 6 months at this rate. I believe in the mission, but if we don't stabilize soon..." He hesitated. "The people may turn." Traoré looked at him for a long moment. then asked, would they rather be hungry in their own voice or full in someone else's? Coulibaly didn't answer, because there was no easy answer. The truth was, Traoré knew what was coming. He could feel the storm tightening. He could see the maneuvering, the whispers, the foreign ambassadors smiling with too many teeth, the journalists sharpening pens like knives. But he also saw something else. He saw the farmers who came to the capital with their hands calloused and their chests bare, chanting in 5 different native languages, "We will not kneel again." He saw the grandmother in a tiny northern village teaching a 6-year-old how to count using the rhythm of ancestral songs. He saw the boy who emailed his office and wrote, in broken Moray, "Thank you for letting my voice be enough." And that is what kept him from breaking. But Nanga's betrayal still lingered like a wound that wouldn't clot. And then it happened. 3 nights later, a convoy was intercepted near the southern border. Inside, officials found boxes. Inside the boxes, carefully hidden beneath sacks of grain and aid documents, were weapons, French-made rifles, brand new. The destination? A military outpost near Ouagadougou. And who had signed off on the delivery? Nanga. Traoré stared at the manifest for over an hour. No one spoke. The silence was terrifying. They expected an arrest, a televised purge, a brutal takedown, but instead, Traoré stood, walked to the window, and whispered, "We were born under foreign flags, raised under foreign schools. Even our bullets come with their names on them. But this betrayal, is ours." Then he turned back and said, "Let the people see everything." The next morning, the evidence was released. Every document, every shipment manifest, every connection traced to foreign banks, every name involved. He didn't call for blood, he called for clarity. Let them see who truly sold their soul. Let them decide what future they wanted. And the people responded. They didn't riot, they didn't burn, they mourned. They mourned the loss of innocence, the realization that not all enemies wore foreign colors. Some wore the very flag they claimed to defend. In the center of the capital, a massive silent march was organized. Tens of thousands dressed in traditional cloth. No slogans, no chants, just silence. They walked from the old French colonial headquarters to the steps of the new Cultural Language Institute, a building Traoré had ordered, built just weeks before. At the front of the march, a little girl held up a sign. It read, "We are not what they named us. We are what we remember." That image went viral across the globe. Suddenly, Burkina Faso wasn't just a political crisis, it was a cultural awakening. France scrambled. Their narratives were crumbling. Their strategies were being outmaneuvered. Every attempt to frame Traoré as a fanatic backfired because he never matched their caricature. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, he didn't hide. He stood, and people followed. But the betrayals weren't over yet. Late that week, during a routine military drill, a young officer slipped a folded note to Traoré's personal guard. Inside, scribbled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "They are planning something. Sunday, at the parade, check the blue van." It was signed by an anonymous cadet. Security swept the grounds, and there it was, a blue van parked unusually close to the national parade platform. Inside, explosives timed, wired, ready, a plan to assassinate Traoré in front of the world. And once again, the device was French-made. He cancelled the parade without explanation, told the public it was due to unforeseen weather. But inside the palace there was no illusion. This was war, not the kind with armies and front lines, but a war of nerves, of trust, of identity, a war where your best friend could be your enemy, where your colonizer dressed like your ally, where your own people could be bought. But Traoré also knew something else. He wasn't alone anymore. The language was spreading. Other African leaders were quietly introducing native language policies. Universities in Kenya, Uganda, and even Senegal began launching courses in indigenous tongues. Ghanaian media ran documentaries titled "The Year We Spoke for Ourselves." And in Burkina Faso, people waited, not for aid, not for rescue, but for the next word, the next. Because this was no longer about banning French, this was about remembering who they were before they were renamed, before they were retaught, before they were rewritten. And Traoré was no longer just a captain, he was the memory keeper, and memories do not die easily. The letter arrived without a seal, no flags, no signatures. Just a folded white envelope slipped quietly into the hands of a low-ranking official who wasn't supposed to be there. Inside, one sentence. You have 72 hours to reverse the decision or consequences will follow. There was no name, no insignia, but the weight behind the words didn't need either. Everyone knew where it came from. France had finally dropped the act. For weeks they had fought with diplomacy, with headlines, with humiliation, but none of it had broken him. Not the economic pressure, not the betrayal from Nanga, not even the assassination attempt. And now they were done pretending. Traoré sat with the letter in his hand for a long time. He didn't speak, he didn't move, only his thumb pressed into the paper, slowly, deliberately, like he was feeling the pulse of something ancient buried inside the ink. The room around him waited, his generals, his advisors. They were all watching him, breathing just a little slower than normal, because everyone in that room knew what this was. This wasn't a warning, this was an ultimatum. Reverse the ban, reinstate French as the official language of Burkina Faso, or face consequences, the kind of consequences that history books usually call necessary intervention. The silence in the war room was suffocating. Until finally, one advisor whispered what no one wanted to say out loud. "Sir, this could mean war." Traoré didn't look up. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "They've already been at war with us. We just didn't call it that." And he was right. It hadn't started with bullets. It had started with ideas, with textbooks, with embassies doubling as control centers, with languages that erased grandparents from classrooms, with handshakes that came with strings tied to European banks. But now it was beginning to look like the old wars again. 3 days. That's what they were given. And as the clock began to tick, so did the plan. France moved fast. Before the 72 hours were up, they activated Phase 2. Flights to and from Burkina Faso were suspended due to safety concerns. Burkinabe officials' accounts were flagged across major international banks. A coalition of Western aid groups announced a temporary pause in humanitarian operations. And most chilling of all, French media began to publish unverified reports about civil unrest and potential massacres within Burkina Faso. A lie, but a dangerous one, because that's how invasions begin. Create the illusion of chaos, paint the leader as unstable, convince the world he's gone rogue, and then walk in with soldiers and say you're saving the people. They had done it before, to Gaddafi, to Sankara, to Lumumba, the same script, different country, same handwriting, but this time the target was ready. While France moved with power, Traoré moved with precision. He called no press conferences, issued no statements. Instead, he sent teams quietly across the borders, to Mali, to Niger, to Guinea, countries that had once been wary of his radical shift, but now were watching closely. He didn't ask for troops, he didn't ask for weapons, he asked for truth. "Let your journalists come," he said. "Let your filmmakers, your poets, your writers see for themselves. Walk our streets, talk to our people, let them tell their own story." Because Traoré understood something the West hadn't. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. This was about the right of any African nation to choose its own identity, to speak in its own voice. And if France crushed that, every other African leader would be next. And that fear, that quiet fear, was beginning to grow. In Lagos, a Nigerian senator gave a speech calling Traoré a symbol of post-colonial courage. In Accra, Ghanaian students staged a sit-in titled "Our Language is Our Future." In South Africa, a popular radio host wept live on air saying, "This young man, this captain, is carrying the weight of an entire continent." But the clock kept ticking. France was preparing something big. Intelligence gathered by loyalists in Côte d'Ivoire confirmed movement. Foreign contractors, intelligence assets, discreet arms shipments moving toward the Burkina border under the radar of the public eye. They were preparing for a covert intervention, not a full-scale invasion, that would be too obvious. This would be quieter, targeted, precise, install a puppet leader, restore the French language, stabilize the region, and move on. Traoré was not surprised. He was ready, but readiness doesn't remove pain. It doesn't erase the ache of knowing your own continent won't all stand beside you, because as the pressure mounted, so did the silence. Some were too indebted to speak, some too afraid, some too invested in their deals with Paris to risk solidarity. So they said nothing, and in that nothing was a knife. But the people did not stay silent. Across Burkina Faso, mass mobilizations began. No weapons, no riots, just voices. Tens of thousands of citizens stood in open fields, markets, mosques, churches, schools. They raised their hands, not in surrender, but in unity. One voice, one chant, in dozens of different native tongues. We are not afraid to speak. In Koudougou, children wrote the phrase on their school walls in chalk. In Ouagadougou, elders painted it onto their homes with red earth. In the north, a group of blind griots, the ancient oral historians, stood before a crowd and sang the names of every tribe, every dialect, every word France once tried to erase. And in the capital, a teenage girl went viral for saying, "Let them come. We've already found our voice. Even if they silence our leader, they cannot unhear us." France was losing the information war. For the first time, their narrative wasn't sticking, and so they changed their tone. The French president appeared on TV, seated behind a desk flanked by flags. "France has always stood for liberty," he said. "We are deeply concerned about the direction of leadership in Burkina Faso. We urge Captain Traoré to think of his people, think of their children, think of their future." But the people already knew Traoré was thinking of the children. That's why he'd risked everything. That night, he finally addressed the nation, not in a palace, not on a podium, but from a village school. The room was small, dimly lit, filled with young students who sat on the floor in silence. He stood in front of a chalkboard and spoke. "I was born into French. I studied in French. I was taught that to succeed I must speak in French." He paused. "But when I came home, I realized my people were silent because they were told their voices didn't matter." Another pause. "Well, I am here to say, your voices matter, your words matter, and no one will ever erase them again." He turned to the students and asked, "Can I teach you something?" They nodded. He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote one word in bold, proud Moore. Zabre. Freedom. He turned back to the camera and finished. "To the powers that threaten us, I do not fear your consequences. I fear my people forgetting who they are. That is a consequence I will not accept." The video spread across the globe. And then, 24 hours later, France moved. They came just before dawn, no declaration, no flags, no national anthem announcing arrival, just the quiet hum of low-flying aircraft over Burkina Faso's eastern border, a rhythm so faint it could have been mistaken for wind. But it wasn't wind, it was war dressed in shadows. A convoy of unmarked vehicles crossed the border near Faden-Gourma. No insignias, no visible flags. But their destination was clear, the capital. Their mission was clearer. France wasn't sending a message anymore. They were enforcing one. Back in Ouagadougou, the streets were already full. Thousands upon thousands of Burkinabe citizens, shoulder to shoulder, surrounding government buildings, blocking every access road, arms linked not in protest, but in protection. Not a weapon among them, no stones, no bottles, just words. One voice rose above the others. If they want to silence him, they must first silence us all. Inside the palace, Traoré stood at the window, the weight of every name, every face, every ancestor behind him. He knew this was not just an attack on a government, it was an attack on a soul, a culture, a people who dared to say, "We will define ourselves." A knock at the door. One of his commanders entered, pale. "Sir, the French-trained special unit just breached the outer checkpoint." "How many?" Traoré asked. We estimate 30, equipped, silent, surgical. Traore nodded. He wasn't surprised. This was how empires ended rebellions now, not with tanks and bombs, but with surgical operations. He turned to his guard. I want the media team ready. Record everything. If I fall, let the world see who fired the bullet. And yet, no bullets came. Because something had shifted. At the entrance of the city, the convoy was met by something no military unit could have prepared for. Thousands of children lined up along the roads in absolute silence, holding signs in native scripts that read, "We are our own language now." You cannot kill a voice. The soldiers slowed. One of them, barely older than 22, looked out the window and whispered, "They're just kids." Behind the children stood the elders. Behind them, women and teachers. Then the doctors. Then the shopkeepers. Then the students. And behind all of them, farmers and griots, barefoot men and women, mothers with babies strapped to their backs, imams and pastors standing side by side. A wall of people, unarmed, unshaken. Too many, we can't move forward without trampling civilians. The commander hesitated, then cursed. But what truly stopped them wasn't numbers, it was what came next. From the rooftops a sound rose, not a siren, not a gunshot, but a language. The people began to chant, not in French, in Moray, in Dioula, in Fulfulde, in Bissa, in Gulmansema, in tongues older than cathedrals, words that had survived slavery, colonization, forced assimilation, words whispered in huts, sung in lullabies, etched into the bones of the land. They sang a song not taught in schools, a song not found in books, a song handed down by voice alone, generation to generation. It was the sound of identity, of history refusing to die. The convoy stopped completely. One soldier dropped his weapon, then another, one knelt, another wept. The commanding officer made a final call back to command. They're not resisting with force, but we can't proceed, not without killing half the city. The response was cold. Fall back. And just like that, the invasion failed, not with blood, but with memory, not with violence, but with voice. Back at the palace, Traore was watching the live stream, silent. Then finally, he smiled. For the first time in weeks, he sat down, not from exhaustion, but from peace. Later that night, the French president issued a statement filled with elegant emptiness. France respects the sovereignty of all nations, he said. There was no planned military intervention. Any reports otherwise are unfounded. But the world knew. The footage had already spread. Millions had seen it. Millions more were speaking about it. And then something happened that no one expected. Apologies began to arrive, from students in Paris, from musicians in Montreal, from professors in Belgium, messages sent online, in letters, in songs. We didn't know. We weren't taught. We were wrong. But Traore wasn't waiting for apologies. He was building. In the following weeks, Burkina Faso launched the largest native language education reform on the continent. Teachers were retrained, villages were equipped. Radios began broadcasting news in 5 different tongues. The African Linguistic Union expanded, member states joined, funding increased. A South African tech company developed a translation app based on Burkinabe dialects. A Senegalese filmmaker announced a documentary called The Language War. The ripple had become a wave, and yet Traore remained quiet. He gave few speeches, turned down interviews, declined awards, because this had never been about him. It was about something much larger. A few weeks after the failed intervention, a delegation from Ghana visited Ouagadougou. One of their ministers asked Traore a question. "Captain, you've changed the continent. How did you do it?" Traore looked up and after a long pause said, "I didn't change anything. I just reminded our people what they already knew." Later, a journalist asked him what scared him most now. He said that we will forget again. Because forgetting is how it starts, not with bullets, with silence, not with shackles, with shame. Not with conquest, but with compromise, the kind that tells you, Just speak their way, it's easier. Just learn their rules, it's safer. Just erase yourself a little, it's progress. But Burkina Faso remembered, and in that memory, it found power. One night, Traore visited the village where his mother was buried. No cameras, no guards, just him. He stood by her grave and whispered in More. "We spoke, Mama." We finally spoke, and the wind answered back, not in words, but in peace. Because now even the silence